Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're unpacking a fundamental transformation facing modern democracy, the digital ballot box. We are diving deep into the intricate, and you'll see often very polarized, debate around electronic voting.
That's exactly right. For decades, the implementation of what we call information and communication technologies, or ICT, has been, steadily reshaping our political landscapes.
Right.
We see it everywhere in how citizens engage, how campaigns are run, and most critically, how that core act of casting a ballot is being challenged and, well, modernized.
And the conversation around e-voting, electronic voting, it really went from theoretical to critically urgent back in 2020. I mean, the COVID-19 pandemic forced governments everywhere, including Poland, to just scramble for safe, viable alternatives to traditional in-person elections.
It absolutely did. And that crisis just accelerated the timeline on these digital governance discussions that have been sort of simmering for years.
So our deep dive today is built entirely on a really comprehensive academic study from 2020 and 2021, and it focuses specifically on Polish attitudes toward e-voting.
And this research provides a stunningly clear snapshot of public opinion. It reveals these sharp, almost predictable divides along social, demographic, and political lines. You know, who champions digital ballots and who views them with a lot of suspicion.
So our mission today is clear. We need to unpack these deeply rooted social cleavages, understand the political math, really, behind the support and the opposition, and analyze what the Polish public sees as the biggest, most unforgivable challenges to adopting this technology.
And, before we even get into the data, we have to start with a crucial definitional point. It's so important because it frames every single survey response we're about to discuss.
Okay.
The researchers found that for the vast majority of Polish respondents, and we're talking a staggering 74.13% when they hear the term electronic voting, they're thinking primarily about remote internet voting.
So i-voting.
I-voting, exactly. They imagine casting a ballot securely from their home computer or their tablet or even their phone. They are not primarily focused on, say, voting machines inside a traditional supervised polling place.
That is a critical distinction. It means the whole public debate is centered on convenience and accessibility, but also
Maximum security risk.
maximum security risk because the voting environment is totally uncontrolled. Okay, let's start, though, by establishing the basics. What exactly is e-voting, and what are the major drivers pushing for it around the world?
Okay, so at its simplest, e-voting is just an alternative method to paper or postal voting. It means casting a vote using so the internet, telephony, dedicated digital platforms, and it's widely considered one of the primary tools of modern e-democracy.
And when we focus on internet voting specifically, the source material breaks it down pretty neatly into three main types, and it really illustrates that classic trade-off between control and convenience. How does that spectrum work?
Right, it's all about proximity and supervision. So at one end, you have internet voting machines located within traditional polling places.
Right, so you still have to go there.
You still have to go. This offers the absolute highest security and administrative control because the device is monitored, it's supervised by election officials, it might even be isolated from external networks. The drawback is obvious. It's the lowest accessibility. You still have to travel, it's digital, but it's static.
That feels like a pretty modest improvement over paper ballots. I mean, it mostly just benefits the administration through faster counting, right?
Exactly. Then, moving down the spectrum, you find remote internet kiosks. These might be set up outside a polling station, maybe in a library or a municipal building.
So still in a public controlled space.
The controlled public space, yes. It offers remote voting, but under some degree of supervision. So you get a high level of security, moderate control, and, well, moderate accessibility.
And then we hit the big one, the one that 74% of Polish citizens are actually thinking about, remote internet voting, or i-voting, from a personal computer or a mobile phone.
This is the revolutionary and, frankly, the most controversial option. It offers the highest accessibility. You can vote from anywhere, anytime, within that defined window. But all that freedom comes at the cost of the lowest control.
Because the device and the environment are private.
Completely private. And that means a moderate, or some would argue a very low level of security compared to supervised options. And this lack of control is where all those concerns about coercion and the secrecy of the ballot really come from.
It's the highest reward, highest risk approach. So now that we get the technology, let's look at the why. What are the motivations for countries to even consider this? The study highlights three key groups: voters, the administration, and politicians. Let's start with the voters. What's the appeal for them?
For the individual voter, the motivation is just pure convenience and mobility. E-voting lets them cast a ballot from practically any place and any time, as long as they have internet. It transforms voting from, a fixed, sometimes time-consuming obligation into a simple digital transaction.
And I imagine this convenience disproportionately benefits specific demographics, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's particularly transformative for two major groups. First, highly mobile voters, so expatriates living abroad, students away at university, or professionals who travel for work. For them, remote voting just eliminates the logistical nightmare of proxy ballots or registering at overseas consulates. And second, and this is crucial, those with physical disabilities or the elderly who often face, significant barrier stairs, lack of transport, long queues, just to get to a traditional polling place. E-voting gets rid of that physical barrier entirely. It dramatically enhances the principle of universality.
So it turns a physical barrier into a digital solution. Okay, now what about the administration, the State Election Commission? What's the driving appeal for them?
For the administration, it's all about efficiency and accuracy. E-voting has the potential to dramatically increase the accuracy and the speed of counting votes. If it's done right, it can eliminate the potential for all those little human errors that election officials make during manual counting and tallying.
Which can be surprisingly common in close elections.
They absolutely can. And what about the long-term economics? We often hear this framed as a cost-saving measure.
Right.
Well, the initial implementation costs are undeniably massive. I mean, developing the system, rigorously securing it, training people, getting the hardware, it's a huge investment.
Yeah.
But proponents argue there's long-term potential for operational cost reduction.
Fewer people on the ground.
Far fewer. You'd need fewer temporary election officials, less printing of physical ballots, reduced transportation costs. Plus, often the implementation requires establishing a central benefit of cleaning up voter rolls and reducing multiple voting.
Okay, so finally we come to the political dimension. What do parties and politicians hope to gain by championing such a seismic shift?
It's a mixture of optics and electoral hope. In terms of optics, politicians who support e-voting get this image of being modern, innovative, forward-thinking, bringing democracy into the 21st century. But the real driver, that's electoral calculation.
They're hoping to change the turnout landscape.
Precisely. The political class largely believes that making voting easier will increase turnout, especially among demographics that traditionally vote less frequently, like young people and expatriates.
Right.
And if e-voting successfully mobilizes those groups, it could fundamentally alter the distribution of parliamentary seats and the whole electoral structure, benefiting the parties that are aligned with those demographics.
That makes it inherently political from the moment it's even proposed. Before we dive into the Polish situation, let's quickly look at two global examples the research cites. Estonia as the sort of poster child, and Switzerland as the cautionary tale.
Estonia is the clear global leader, no question. They implemented full internet voting way back in 2005 for all their elections, local, parliamentary, EU, and they have steadily built public trust over almost 2 decades now.
And the adoption is huge, right?
It's enormous. In the 2019 European Parliament elections, almost half, 46.7% of participants voted online. Their system relies on a high degree of digital integration in the country, using a computer with a secure EID card or a special SIM card with PIN codes to establish a verifiable digital identity.
That level of adoption shows it's technologically possible and that you can get public buy-in if you build trust over time. But Switzerland, which has this deep democratic tradition of referendums, took a very different path.
A very different path. Switzerland started early, too, testing i-voting systems way back in 1998. But they are the perfect example of robust testing meeting, persistent security reality.
What happened?
Because of these highly publicized persistent security concerns, audits found major vulnerabilities in their systems. The Swiss authorities made the dramatic decision to halt and withdraw those systems entirely in the summer of 2019.
They just hit the security ceiling.
They did. And this demonstrates a critical lesson. Even with years of commitment and testing, if your standard for security and integrity is high enough, and it has to be in a democracy, even theoretical vulnerabilities can stop implementation cold. The security bar has to be 100%, not 95%.
So we have this clear global spectrum possibility shown by Estonia and the incredibly high security risk shown by Switzerland's withdrawal. Let's bring this debate squarely back into the Polish context.
The legal landscape in Poland is fascinatingly neutral. The Polish electoral law doesn't explicitly permit or forbid internet voting.
So it's a gray area.
It's a complete gray area. And that means the debate is primarily constitutional. It's about whether e-voting can be reconciled with the country's foundational electoral principles.
And these principles are critical because they define what a fair election has to look like in Poland. Which ones are most challenged by, remote digital voting?
There were three main constitutional principles at play: powszechność, universality; tajność, secrecy, anonymity; and bezpośredniość, direct. Now, regarding universality, e-voting is generally seen as compatible. We've talked about this. The law requires solutions that make it easier for people to vote, and e-voting does that, especially for the disabled and for expats.
So it passes the universality test. But what about secrecy? That seems like the big one.
Tajność, or secrecy, is arguably the primary constitutional hurdle. The principle demands that no one should know how a person voted, and the voter has to be free from coercion.
And when a vote is cast from a private, uncontrolled environment, like a home computer.
Exactly. How can the integrity of that ballot be maintained? There's no supervision to ensure the voter wasn't pressured by a family member or an employer sitting right next to them. That technological and legislative hurdle of guaranteeing anonymity in a remote setting has not been fully solved.
That goes way beyond technical security and into the practical reality of democracy. What about bezpośredniość, or directness? This sounds like a technicality, but it's critical for voter identity.
Directness means the voter casts their vote directly for the candidate or party. But it's also interpreted as requiring personal voting, that the authorized, registered person is truly the one physically casting the vote.
And with iVoting.
The concern is delegation or authentication risk.
Yeah.
How certain are we that the authorized person is the one at the computer? They could have shared their password, been coerced, or had their identity stolen. That fundamentally challenges the directness of the Electoral Act itself.
And this debate, as the source material shows, is not new. It's been a political flashpoint for well over a decade in Poland.
Oh, it's been a classic political football since at least 2007. After the parliamentary elections that year, the debate just reached a fever pitch. On one side, you had Donald Tusk, then leader of the Liberal Civic Platform, or Platforma Obywatelska. PO and PO strongly championed iVoting.
And why did they champion it?
It all came down to electoral calculus. PO represents the more urban, younger, tech-savvy, and expatriate parts of Polish society. Tusk saw iVoting as a way to engage his natural base and increase their votes, which would likely shift the national balance of power.
And the conservative reaction from Law and Justice, or Prawa i Sprawiedliwość, PIS led by Jarosław Kaczyński, was predictably opposed.
Vehemently opposed. Kaczyński argued that electronic voting would fundamentally trivialize the solemn act of voting. For PI, which draws its support from older, more rural, traditional segments, opposing e-voting served two purposes.
Which were?
Philosophically, it defended the traditional sacred civic ritual, and politically, it was a defense mechanism against a technological change that would almost certainly benefit their opponents by mobilizing demographics that are hostile to PI.
This historical anecdote makes the later data on political polarization entirely predictable. But the source gives us an actual demonstration of the raw appeal of the digital method in action, the 2010 PO primary.
That internal presidential primary is a perfect case study. They let party members choose between their two candidates, using both traditional mail and a simplified, very accessible form of internet voting.
They made it almost too easy, didn't they? They published the voting card, username, and password right in the party magazine.
They absolutely embraced accessibility, and the results were decisive. Turnout was very high for an internal primary. Nearly 48% of members participated, and the electronic method just completely dominated.
How much?
17,000 members voted online, versus only about 4,000 who bothered to vote by mail. And this event, reported everywhere in media, proved that if a convenient electronic option is offered, even a basic one, the digitally engaged population will use it overwhelmingly.
That preference is undeniable. So fast forward to today. Which political groups are still the loudest cheerleaders for this?
The strongest, most consistent advocates for iVoting since 2015 have been the groups promoting direct democracy tools, especially the Kukiz 15 movement. They fundamentally believe that increasing participation through easier methods is key to reforming the whole political system.
But despite this high-profile debate, and despite that immediate need for alternatives during the 2020 pandemic, the source notes that electronic voting still didn't become the central media focus in Poland.
That's a key detail that's often overlooked. While the pandemic did spur discussion, The media debate in Poland overwhelmingly focused on the logistics of mass postal voting. That was the solution pushed by the ruling conservative coalition at the time. It was complex, but it didn't require a fundamental overhaul of the electoral security infrastructure.
So e-voting, which demanded that these major constitutional and technical questions be answered immediately, just remained the secondary, more complicated issue. Okay, let's pivot now to the empirical evidence, the heart of this research. The data comes from a 2018 survey of over 1,700 polls, a sample designed to be demographically representative. We have to start with the most dramatic cleavage, the generational divide.
The age split is stark. It reveals a fundamental divergence in attitudes toward modernization and, really, civic duty. Younger groups, especially those between 18 and 44, were significantly more positive about e-voting. They were more willing to use it and felt it was a necessary step into the digital age.
But the research isolated a specific peak of enthusiasm, didn't it?
Yes, it did. The groups showing the most positive opinions, the ones who most strongly agreed that implementation was just a matter of time and should be adopted, was the 35 to 44-year-olds.
That's significant. Not the youngest group, but young professionals.
Precisely. This demographic is digitally native, politically mature, and likely highly mobile professionally. For them, convenience is a premium, and they are fully integrated into digital public services.
Now compare that enthusiastic core to the resistance.
The 65-plus group consistently showed the highest reluctance. They overwhelmingly preferred traditional voting methods, were the least willing to use iVoting, and, this is crucial, they strongly agreed with the statement that voting online lowers the rank of the solemn act of voting.
So for this generation, the act itself holds this serious, almost ceremonial value. Going to the school, waiting in line.
Yes, and a digital vote cast from home trivializes that civic ritual. It transforms a solemn public duty into just another casual transaction.
That's a cultural clash, not just a technical one. They're defending the dignity of the ballot box.
Absolutely. But here is where the finding gets really nuanced, especially on security. While the 35-44 group was most enthusiastic, the edges of the spectrum, the very youngest, 18-24, and the very oldest, 65+, they actually shared the distinction of being the most concerned about electoral fraud and the lack of secrecy.
That's counterintuitive, especially for the youngest group. Why would the digitally native 18 to 24-year-olds be just as worried about security as the 65-plus group?
It could stem from different sources. The oldest group's concern is probably rooted in a general distrust of new, unfamiliar technology. They don't trust what they can't see or touch.
And the youngest?
The youngest group might be reflecting a kind of native digital cynicism. They understand data breaches, phishing, and online vulnerabilities intuitively from their everyday lives. So their security concerns are technically informed, not just generally anxious.
That leads perfectly into the role of education, which often helps bridge that gap between technical understanding and the political process.
It does. The study found a very strong positive correlation between higher education and acceptance of e-voting. Respondents with college or university degrees were significantly more open to the concept. They saw the benefits, convenience, ease of participation, and were far more willing to say they'd use it if it were available.
So higher education means higher acceptance. What about lower education levels?
Individuals with primary or vocational education were the most critical and skeptical overall. The study confirms that for almost every positive statement about e-voting, this group showed the lowest mean response, indicating a real, deep-seated skepticism.
But there's a major critical exception here regarding security among the highly educated. This is one of the most surprising takeaways from the source.
It truly is a paradox. While the highly educated were generally pro-e-voting, people with advanced degrees were the most likely group to agree that remote internet voting does not guarantee the secrecy or anonymity of the vote.
That's fascinating. So they are the most technically literate, they recognize the flaw, yet they still support it. What does that tell you about their internal calculation?
It suggests their support is pragmatic, not naive. They understand the technical limitations, the inherent risk of coercion or tracing, but they prioritize the overwhelming convenience and efficiency gains over that absolute guarantee of secrecy.
So for them, the benefit to participation and their own mobility outweighs the perceived security risk.
Exactly. They are calculated supporters, fully aware of the trade-offs, which just speaks volumes about the high value placed on convenience by the highly educated mobile elite.
Let's look at the geographic dimension next. The urban versus rural split. Innovation adoption often follows infrastructure, and we see that reflected here.
Absolutely. City dwellers, especially those in Poland's largest cities, were consistently the most positive group. They showed the lowest skepticism and the greatest willingness to use I-voting. And this cluster aligns perfectly with the educated mobile workforce we just talked about.
And the rural areas.
Residents of rural areas and small towns showed the highest level of skepticism. They were the least likely to agree that e-voting is much more convenient than traditional voting. For them, it's an unnecessary, maybe untrustworthy innovation that relies on infrastructure they might not have or skills they don't feel confident using.
And you mentioned professional status briefly. How does being in the workforce influence these views?
The study clearly shows that professional engagement drives positive attitudes. People who are employed full-time, self-employed, studying, they all showed a significantly more positive attitude.
The mobile groups.
The mobile groups whose daily lives involve digital transactions. Conversely, groups less integrated into that, economy retirees, the unemployed, people managing the household, were the most critical. Support is driven by the tangible benefits of professional mobility.
So, to summarize the ideal supporter. Generally, between 35 and 44, holds a university degree, lives in a large city, and is professionally active. They prioritize convenience, even if they have some sophisticated security concerns. This demographic profile is a perfect bridge to understanding the political polarization.
That demographic profile absolutely determines the political fault lines. The research confirmed its main hypothesis. Attitudes toward e-voting are highly polarized based on declared political views and voting behavior. I mean, this isn't just a technical debate. It is a manifestation of tribal political identity.
Okay, so let's start with the supportive electorates. Which political bases are most enthusiastic about bringing in digital voting?
Well, voters and potential voters for center-left and liberal parties were significantly more positive and more willing to use e-voting. The highest levels of support came from electorates of Partia Razem, the left, Nowoczesna, modern, Platforma Obywatelska, PO, and that direct democracy movement, Kukiz 15.
Which are the parties that explicitly target those younger, urban, educated demographics we just established?
Exactly. Their political structure benefits from this type of modernization.
And on the opposing side, which electorates are fueling the skepticism and the resistance?
The lowest support came from voters of conservative and agrarian parties. Specifically, supporters of Prawo i Sprawiedliwość, PIS, the major conservative party, and Polskie Strony Ludowe, PSL, the agrarian party. And crucially, the group who declared they would never vote also showed very low support.
Which suggests a general deep-seated distrust of all electoral procedures, new or old.
Right. And this perfectly tracks the historical opposition led by PES, which is rooted in defending the dignity of the Electoral Act. So how did that ideological axis show up in the survey data?
Well, it was clearest in the philosophical statement. Respondents who identified as left or center-left were significantly more positive about the benefits and implementation compared to those identifying as right or far-right.
And that core cultural objection, whether e-voting lowers the rank of the solemn act of voting.
The highest agreement came directly from supporters of PS and the individuals who never vote.
That is the nexus of the polarization. The conservative base views the proposed solution as insulting the established democratic process. For them, often older, more religious, more rural, the method itself is profoundly political. They see it as degrading the dignity and solemnity of the whole process.
It's a formidable cultural barrier. It's not just a bug they want fixed.
Exactly. The party structure protects its base by defending the traditional method.
Now, despite the political hopes that e-voting will revolutionize turnout, the research shows that even the most committed voters are skeptical of this effect.
This is a great nuance. It shows the complexity of turnout dynamics. While low-frequency voters, those who rarely participate, were more likely to agree that I-voting influences voter turnout.
The high-frequency voters, the ones who always vote,
They were actually less likely to agree that I-voting would drive up participation.
that's cynical, isn't it? The people who always vote don't believe convenience will mobilize the non-voters. Why do you think that is?
Well, they're committed to the process regardless of the difficulty. They probably believe that those who don't vote aren't held back by logistics like having to walk to a polling place, but by deeper issues. Apathy, distrust in the system, a belief that their vote won't change anything.
So they see convenience as primarily benefiting them, the existing voters, rather than mobilizing a huge wave of apathetic non-voters. It's a logistical fix, not a motivational one.
That's a great way to put it. And we also saw political differences in how parties framed these fundamental principles. For example, the liberal and left parties downplayed the threat to universality.
How so?
Voters for Partia Razem and Nowoczesna, both pro-e-voting parties, were significantly less likely to agree that e-voting poses a threat to universality.
Hmm.
The risk of excluding the elderly or those without internet.
And on the other side?
Voters for PIS and PSL emphasized this risk. It perfectly captures the political framing. Liberals focus on the benefits for the mobile and young, minimizing the exclusion risk, while conservatives focus on those potentially excluded, the elderly, the rural, thereby highlighting the threat to protect their base.
And finally, let's look at the specific security concerns, which, again, follow these political lines.
When you analyze the specific opinions that e-voting creates a risk of electoral fraud or lacks guaranteed secrecy, the most suspicious voters were precisely those of PIS and PSL, and those who never vote. These are the groups most distrustful of systemic change.
And the liberal center-left base.
The groups least concerned about security breaches or fraud were the voters for Partia Razem and Platforma Obywatelska. The alignment is nearly flawless. Those who stand to gain electorally are the least concerned about the integrity and security risks, and those who stand to lose are the most vocal about the lack of them.
So the political debate isn't really about the technology itself.
Not at all. It's about the electoral consequences of its implementation.
So to synthesize this whole analysis, the research confirms that the introduction of e-voting is seen as pretty much inevitable by a large, influential segment of the Polish population, specifically the educated, urban, and young, and it's driven overwhelmingly by this demand for convenience and modernization.
But this public acceptance is profoundly differentiated. The support runs along these clear social cleavages based on age, education, location, and most powerfully, along entrenched political lines between the left, center-left, and the right conservative parties. The issue is just fundamentally tribal.
Which leaves Polish authorities facing a monumental core challenge. The most vocal skepticism comes from groups resistant to digital innovation, the older, rural, and less educated voters, and from conservative political segments who are highly effective at mobilizing those voters. Their resistance isn't just technical. It centers on fundamental, non-negotiable democratic principles: the secrecy, the security, and the perceived integrity of the Electoral Act.
And the irony we uncovered is that the highly educated support the system despite being aware of its security flaws, while the culturally conservative oppose it based on its perceived threat to democratic solemnity. This means the problem isn't just code, it's culture.
So if the trajectory toward e-voting is genuinely inevitable, given this strong political and demographic polarization, and the fact that convenience is such a powerful, persistent driver, what concrete steps, beyond simply improving the technology, must a government take to build universal trust in the system? Specifically, how can they reassure the older, more rural, and politically conservative segments of the electorate who currently equate modernization with the trivialization and degradation of their democracy? That is the ultimate test for modern governance.